On the 18th of February 1952, a group of 18 men and one married woman left Germany on an adventurous journey to South Australia. They had signed a contract with the company Wender and Derholt GmbH in Germany to erect 500 timber-framed homes for the Housing Trust in South Australia in a time frame of 2 years. The paper in hand by those contract workers was a 2-year visa granted by the Commonwealth Government, travelling to a continent many of them had never heard of. Their journey began in Lennep. They travelled by train to Cologne and then by express train to Genoa. Staying overnight in a hotel before boarding a ship called Roma, which sailed under the flag Flotta Laura down the coast of Italy. All but 2 of these young men were too young to have been in uniform and serve in World War II, but now were travelling the world in a peacetime situation. Crossing the Mediterranean Sea to Port Said through the Suez Canal to the Gulf of Aden and Indian Ocean to Colombo. Staying some 24 hours in Ceylon and then sailing on to Australia. The next stop was Fremantle, Western Australia. The immigration people came on board to check on papers. However, nothing was said, nor did the contract workers understand sufficiently the English language. They sailed on to Port Melbourne, Victoria, and disembarked the ship. It was March the 20th, 1952. The language became a more outstanding problem. In the group were 2 managers appointed by the owner, director of Wender and Derholt. These managers and the wife of one of the 2 men found themselves accommodation in the city, while the papers had to be sorted out for continuation of their journey. Due to not having any money, most of the men were left to fend for themselves, carrying their suitcases to the botanical gardens. There they stayed and waited for 2 days for the outcome of paperwork. Luckily, the Roma stayed in port for another day, so they managed to go to the ship to have a meal. The train tickets became available for Friday night's journey to Adelaide, arriving at 10 a.m. at the Adelaide railway station. The group of 19 people stepped from the train with excitement, confused and somehow lost again. There was no one there to meet them. After some hours of waiting, a bus arrived and took the group on a journey to Warradale, known to the locals in those days as the Bush, and next to an army camp. The bus stopped just past the army camp on Morford Road, adjacent to a partly destroyed vineyard. The Housing Trust had started to build some 4-roomed cottages. At this time, none of the cottages were completed. No electricity was connected, but the Housing Trust Authority came to assist in rescuing the contract workers and made 3 cottages available as accommodation. A nearby Milky, a small farmer, brought some bales of straw, which were used as beds. During the voyage, the manager of the company, Walter Wiegelman, had handed out at different locations travel allowance to each person. The amount of travel allowance was £10. Little money was left in any one pocket when arriving in Warradale. For the following week, the group managed to survive the best they could, eating the cheapest food available, mainly bread, frits and jam. Eggs were obtained from a nearby farm and picking the leftover grapes from the destroyed vineyard. Some days went by before the company bought a teapot big enough for the people. The cost of the cottages came to 16 shillings each per week for rent. The amount was divided amongst the men living in these temporary buildings, and the company, Wender and Derholt, made the deductions by taking the money out of the weekly pay packets. In the contracts signed by the workers in Germany, it was very clear the cost of the fare had to be repaid to the employer, Wender and Derholt. and the company would make a weekly £2 deduction out of the wages until the cost had been recovered. It was also mentioned that if the company was successful and the project finished, the money collected for the fares would be given back to the workers. Wender and Derholt also stated in the contract paper that the company would provide camp accommodation for its workers, including a fully equipped kitchen and washing facilities, but it turned out people had to buy their own bed. In the first group of 19 people were 6 men who had been employed by Wender and Derholt in GmbH in Lennep, Germany. 4 of the 6 men were joiner carpenters by trade, all in their early 20s and had never been outside of Germany. But nothing was mentioned to anyone when signing the contract that the workers had to provide their own tools of trade for the project. On Monday the 24th of March 1952, they were introduced to another paddock in Dover Gardens, and they had to start work on the 500 timber-framed houses under a contract signed in Germany with Wender and Derholt GmbH, a project for the South Australian Housing Trust. A 2-kilometre single-lane bitumen road called Morford Road connected the campsite at Warradale to the building site at Dover Gardens. At the time, a 40-hour 5-day week was the norm in Australia. In Germany, it was still a 40-hour 6-day working week. Tradesmen wages in Australia were £12 14 shillings for a 40-hour week, but the employers did not supply tools for the tradesmen. With no tools other than a pick, 2 crowbars and 2 shovels, they started to dig the holes for the stump foundations for the timber frame houses. Red gum timber was used for stumps, jarrah timber was used for bearings and floor joists. All timbers were very green and wet, and the tradesmen did not have any tools to cut that type of timber. A miscalculation of materials and time became visible as time went by, but who was to blame for it remains hidden. The cargo ship Atta had become stranded due to a strike on its journey. It had the essentials for the company on board: camp building and fully equipped kitchen and its canteen. Regardless, not having the essentials, the young adventurous pioneering people became more interested in Australia and loved the warm climate, disregarding the degrading work they had to carry out as qualified tradesmen under orders given by the German management. Some weeks went by before the company bought a local machine, a petrol-driven borer, and then the pre-cut materials for the houses started to arrive, but the bases called foundations for the houses had to be obtained locally. The company slipped into a predicament and had to fly out at their cost 2 first-class tradesmen on a 3-month working permit visa to overcome its tradesman labour shortage and also bear the return airfare cost for those 2 people. By this time, Eugene Lohmann, the owner and director of Wender and Derholt in Germany, had made 2 visits to his new building company in South Australia, but never mentioned under what federal government agreement his company had obtained the financial arrangement to bring German workers with a 2-year working visa to Australia. On the 2nd of May 1952, the Nellie arrived at Port Adelaide, bringing migrants to Australia. The second group of contract workers for Wender and Derholt was aboard. Amongst them were many tradesmen with no tools. By that time, the Housing Trust had completed the 4-room cottages in the vineyard and electricity was connected. All cottages in the paddock had only front fences, which came from a disused sheep yard. The Housing Trust made some more cottages available. It became a situation where 2 people shared a tiny room. The centre room of the cottage, meant to be the kitchen, had a stove fired with wood. And alongside was a cupboard with a sink. In one of the cottages, the kitchen was used as a bar. A lean-to at the back of the cottages, housing the laundry and bathroom. A copper was in the laundry, a chip heater in the bathroom. In many cottages, the door from the kitchen to the laundry was used as a table, laying the door on stacks of suitcases. Late in the year, around about November, the building materials for the camp arrived. But in the meantime, 2 more groups had come to the compound, and the men had brought wives and children along. Not one of the contract workers had discovered the bureaucracy problems the German people had in coming to this country, and the company did not reveal its financial difficulties to its contract workers. Amongst the crates of window glass was a large board bearing the words in German, "Return home, colleague, you are sold." It seems someone back home was giving a warning without telling the full story. But they laboured on regardless in the abandoned market garden field, with no roads, water or electricity being provided beforehand. The grass and weeds competed with the construction of houses during the winter months. The project was completed 2 years later, and the local people called the area the Little Rheinschild for a while. There was no unity amongst the workforce other than having parties, where some men very much enjoyed themselves drinking beer and wine in the camp. The cost in running the camp and the canteen kitchen had to be shared by the contract employees as agreed when signing the contract papers in Germany. It turned out the camp's running cost was much higher compared to the deduction already made in repaying the money for the fare. Due to singing by some men in the camp, the Adelaide Lieder Tafel became uplifted when William Cerns Sr. played the role as a conductor. On the 24th of April 1953, the director, Mr. Schultz, confronted some contract workers with a document called Vereinbarung, trying to enforce the contract workers' loyalty to the Wender and Derholt Australia after they had made the final payment for their fare to the company, but there was never a final receipt given. From the records of the Housing Trust, on the 23rd of the 9th, 1952, a house was made available for manager architect Mr. Helmut Link and his wife as residents for £2 5 per week. A second house became available for the company Wender and Derholt for office use on the 27th of the 1st, 1953 at a cost of £2 and 15 shillings per week. In 1953, Wender and Derholt GmbH in Germany set up for a far more stringent new procedure document due to its application problems, which they had experienced when sending the first batches of contract workers and families to Australia. The weekly £2 deductions in repaying the fare in becoming a Wender and Derholt Australia employee remained in force in the new drafted document. The stringent demand stated in the document turned many good tradesmen away. In 1955, as Wender and Derholt Australia had completed its contract in building 500 timber frame houses for the South Australian Housing Trust, due to the generosity from the Housing Trust in granting a 1-year extension period to complete its project. The total time for the project was 2 years and 6 months. During 1952-1954, the parent company of Wender and Derholt GmbH in Germany and Wender and Derholt Australia had familiarised itself with the former Enemy Alien Regulations Act. In the mid-1950s, the former Enemy Alien Act changed and the German contract workers officially became migrants. However, at the time the workers were not informed over